But it really is an honor and a joy, a deep joy, to introduce to you this morning Mike Merenda.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to read off of my notes. My memory's not so great, so normally when I would public speak when I was union president, I would take hours and days and memorize what I was going to say, and people were always fascinated by that I didn't read from notes or guides. But my memory's not as good now, so I can't do that much longer. I had the opportunity to go online, your website, and listen to some previous speakers, and I got to say, most of what I heard sounded like professional speakers. I think it was because it came from the heart, and they just seemed so natural at doing it. So I have some big shoes to fill, I think, here this morning. What I'm going to talk about is basically a roller coaster ride of my life. More recently, in the last 5 years, being diagnosed with cancer, and I want to thank the Rev for being with me and guiding me and really being a true hero in this story, and you'll hear as I speak exactly what happened. So my latest story begins in October of 2019. I was having trouble swallowing over a few-week period of time. Food was getting stuck in my throat, and so I had suffered from acid reflux since I was a child. I was on medication for it. So I thought it had something to do, obviously, with my GI or my esophagus or my throat. So I made an appointment at the doctor, and they ordered a esophagectomy. My now wife, girlfriend at the time, came with me. This was before everything got shut down with COVID. So we walked into the hospital area where they were going to perform the procedure, and it just so happened that there were two nurses there intaking me, one of which was a former ER nurse that I had spent many years with, being in the ER for hurt cops or criminals or transporting, and she was a wonderful woman. Her name was Carol. And the other nurse just so happened to be a very good friend of mine, police officer's wife. So they made me feel very comfortable. We caught up a little bit, chit-chatted, and I had the procedure. When I woke up, the one nurse, my buddy's wife, she was nowhere to be found, but the ER nurse was still there. And she offered to walk my wife and I to the car, which I thought was nice, but I was a little concerned at that point about why she was actually doing that. When we got closer to the car, she was giving me a hug to say goodbye, and she whispered in my ear that I had a tumor in my esophagus and that it was most likely cancer. The sadness on her face told the whole story. I knew I was in trouble, serious trouble. I didn't tell my girlfriend at the time. I didn't want to hurt her. I kept it to myself, and we drove home. A few days later, I got the call, and it was confirmed that I had esophageal cancer. I wasn't staged yet. They had set up some appointments for me to go to an oncologist and get that staging. Now, I'm familiar with cancer. Back in 2001, I was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma. And over a 12-month period of time, I received chemotherapy and radiation, and it went into remission. But at the time, the doctor told me that I wouldn't be dying from Hodgkin's lymphoma. That was gone, but more than likely another cancer would show up later on in your life. And at that time, I was still young. I was 26. I kind of didn't really pay attention to that. But in fact, that ended up happening. I went to the oncologist, and the plan was to treat the cancer with chemo. And then after completing it, they were going to perform a full esophagectomy, which means they were going to cut my entire esophagus out, stretch my stomach, and reattach it. It's a very serious surgery. It comes with a series of complications, but that was the plan. They couldn't treat me with radiation because I had already received my lifetime dose when I had Hodgkin's lymphoma. So we tried the chemotherapy, and after a series of treatments, I had a CAT scan, and it turned out that the cancer was still there, didn't work. From November of 2019 to March of 2020, I progressively got worse. I was unable to eat anything by mouth, and I started rapidly losing weight. So they attempted to put a stent in my esophagus to help me maintain my nutrition orally, and also placed a feeding tube into my intestine. Normally, when they give you a feeding tube, they put it directly in the stomach. But with the hopes of eventually having an esophagectomy, they put it into my intestine so it wouldn't mess up the stomach that they were eventually going to pull up and attach to my throat. It was very painful and uncomfortable. I was hooked up for 14 hours a day with the feeding tube to feed me. If it went in too fast, it would cause irritation and I would throw up or get diarrhea. So it had to be stretched over a 14-hour period of time where I would sit and have this feeding tube attached to me. In mid-March, I went for a PET scan, and it was discovered that the cancer had metastasized. And because of that, I was now deemed inoperable, and I was terminally ill. My care was now going to be palliative and not curative. My oncologist suggested we try a new type of treatment called immunotherapy. Specifically, the drug name is Keytruda. And it was having great results with other types of cancer, specifically lung cancer. They were having phenomenal results. But they still, there were still some complications because Keytruda takes about 3 months to actually start working once it gets into your system. It's not immediate like a chemotherapy, which is poisoning the body. Keytruda immunotherapy kind of boosts your immune system to fight the cancer and just the cancer. So I was set to start treatment April 6th of 2020, right at the very beginning of the pandemic. And because of that, my wife could not accompany me to my appointments. And during this time, I'm sure you remember, when you went into a hospital, they had to check your temperature with the little thing they rubbed on your forehead. It was a crazy time. So I went to the infusion center, the cancer center, to start my immunotherapy. I walked in, they did the temperature. I was normal. I went upstairs and they started to prep me for treatment. When you start treatment, they do a vital check once again. So they take your blood pressure, your temperature, and your oxygen level. At that point, I had a fever. So the nurse grabbed the doctor. The doctor came in and he said, "How did you get in here with a fever?" They checked at the door. I said, "When I got here, I didn't have a fever. I didn't know why that changed, but it did." So they immediately canceled treatment, thought I was suffering from something else and couldn't realize what the temperature was for, and they admitted me into the hospital. And within 24 hours, my whole world turned upside down. I was told I had a blood infection, they were not going to treat me any longer, and that the cancer had metastasized even more. It was now in my lung, my adrenal gland, and my abdominal cavity. And the original tumor had grown so large that it had completely taken over the stent that they had put in my esophagus. It was now April 7th, going into the next day. I was alone in my room, just trying to get everything together, my thoughts and my concerns, and not knowing what was going to happen. My oncologist, along with my thoracic surgeon, who was originally going to perform the esophagectomy, the resident on the floor in the hospital that I was with, and another woman who I didn't know, but they came into the room, and my oncologist apologized to me and told me that they weren't going to treat me because I was going to die, and that the unknown woman that was in the room was a hospice liaison. They suggested I go home with hospice care and that my life would end. I asked them how long they thought I had, and I was told I had 2 weeks, maybe a month left to live. I couldn't believe it. Other than the fever that I had and not being able to swallow, I didn't feel like I was dying. I was hurting, obviously, because of everything going on, but I certainly didn't feel that I was at death's door. I asked if there were any other options, any other treatments, anything that could be done. And the doctor said that there was a very strong chemo that they could try, but that potentially could kill me before my natural death in 2 weeks to a month. So I refused to go home with hospice, but I told the doctor I would go home and talk to my wife, and we were going to decide if I was going to attempt the chemo or if I was going to stay at home and die at home with my wife. He said, "Why don't we call your wife and talk now?" So I said, okay. We called my wife. I knew it would be devastating, but I needed her guidance. I needed her love. She was actually at home with my 2 children, my oldest son, Christian, who was 14 at the time, and my youngest son, who was 12. And again, all this is happening during quarantine, so everything it was just so much worse. I had to suffer scared and alone in the hospital, while my wife had to suffer scared and alone at home. I told her to make sure she didn't mention it to the kids, though. I really needed to wrap it around my head and figure out the best way I was going to tell them. And I told her hopefully I would be getting out tomorrow, and we hung up the phone. The doctor left, and I remember asking myself how I would tell my children. And at this moment, it truly was the hardest time in my life. Still wondering how I was going to tell my children. And with the clock ticking, I stayed up all night in the hospital. I couldn't imagine my children not having their father there for when they graduated high school or college or got married or, God willing, had some grandchildren. I knew my wife would get the pension, so I knew she would take care of the kids. I was looking for a miracle. I needed a miracle. It was the only way I was going to survive. There was no medicine. There was no more way out. So this was a predicament, and I was completely unprepared for it. I was in a moment of physical and spiritual darkness. Throughout the night, I wanted to pray, but I didn't really know how. I always believed there was a God, but didn't feel I deserved anything from him. I've done a lot of good things in my life, but I had also done a lot of bad, and I hurt a lot of people. But at 8 p.m. that night, 8:18 exactly, on April 7th, John Revell sent me a text. "Hey, brother. Back in December, we were talking about spiritual things and eternity. And I shared this prayer as a model guide for you. I feel compelled to send it again. Still praying for you and would love to talk to you sometime. Love you, Mike." And this is what the prayer said. "Father, I know I've disobeyed you, ignored you, resisted you, and rebelled against you. I know that I was wrong. But I understand that you love me regardless, and that Jesus died to pay the penalty for my sin. I understand that I could never work off my debt against you, but Jesus' death paid it in full. So please forgive me right now. I surrender my whole life over to you right now. I want to follow and obey you from this point on, and I trust you with my life now and forever." At that moment, I asked God to save my life. I asked him to give me some more time to see my children to a point that I thought they could survive without me. I asked God to give me more time with my wife. I did not want to leave her. In return, I prayed and made a promise to God and told him that I would change everything I had to. I would be a good husband, a great father, a good friend, and I would follow Jesus's commands. I would go to church. I would do anything to please you, God, in exchange for my life. The next day I was released from the hospital. I went home without hospice, and the whole time I was just thinking about how I would tell my children. I remember sitting them down. I remember telling them how much I loved them and how much they meant to me. I apologized for anything I had done to them in the past. In this conversation, I wanted to give them a lifetime of advice, but I knew inside they probably would not remember anything I said, except for that I didn't have much time left. They didn't cry, but their faces were frozen. It was ripping my guts out. Part of me wished that they had just cried, but we all deal with things on our own. I assured them I wasn't going to quit. I was going to fight until the last breath I had. My wife and I sat in silence most of the night. We were still in shock because although I was skinny, I didn't feel bad. Certainly not like I was dying. She reminded me, though, however, before I went into the hospital, we had made a second opinion appointment with another oncologist in Norwalk. And we decided to go, even though I had the terrible prognosis of death. I remember this appointment so vividly because when I walked in the doctor room, and again, I was by myself, my wife couldn't join me, the doctor said, "Tell me what's going on." I told him my current oncologist and thoracic surgeon told me death was imminent. And I apologized for wasting his time with the appointment, but I had scheduled it prior to knowing this. And then the words came out of his mouth. "You don't look like you're dying to me." He looked over my medical records that had been sent to him and he said, "I don't believe you're dying and you should be treated immediately." He left the room and said he was going to call the original oncologist that gave me the death sentence. And I remember sitting there thinking, what's going on? Am I getting another shot at life? Did God work that fast? Could he work that fast? I could almost feel the miracle happening in real time. The doctor came back a few minutes later and he said that my current oncologist told him it was a misunderstanding, which to me sounded like a cop-out. I had my discharge paperwork with me and I explicitly read it to him and I carry it with me to this day. And I'm going to read it to you, just the one line. It was suggested that he will need home hospice, however, as death will likely be over the next few days to weeks. I don't think that's a misunderstanding. He told me that the original doctor was going to treat me after they spoke on the phone, but I didn't want to go back to that doctor. But out of professional courtesy, he told me to please go back to the original doctor. I went home and told my wife and kids. As you can imagine, it was a huge relief. Just the thought that they were going to try and treat me lifted all of our spirits. I was treated for the first time with Keytruda on April 17th, 2020. Within just a few short weeks, I started to make a visible turnaround. I was able to start eating. I gained weight. I had more energy. And after a few months of still being displeased with the original oncologist, we got into an issue over a CAT scan. That's a whole nother story. But I reached back out to the second oncologist, Dr. Boxer, in hopes that he would take me on as a patient. I begged him and he agreed. Fast forward to 2021, nearly a year and a half into treatment, while waiting for the results of a CAT scan, my wife, who was an atheist and had been for many years, said a prayer to God. When her prayer was answered, she felt compelled to build a relationship with God, not just reach out when she was in need. From that point, she began to pray regularly and read the Bible. As my wife continued her journey with God, and while I was doing my best to follow him, and although I was still sick and unsure of the future, I finally felt peace. While still being treated with Keytruda in October of 2023, I had a PET scan, and it was revealed that I had zero evidence of disease, no sign of cancer. Prior to this point, I had always had remnants of cancer, and everything had shrunken to the point where I could survive with it, but it had always been there. This time around, it was all gone. I realized that God had chosen to save my life, but it would not be an easy road. This was a tremendous news because it meant I was potentially now a candidate for the life-saving surgery of removing my esophagus. I was scheduled for a full esophagectomy on May 14th, 2024 at NYU in Langone in New York City. What was supposed to be a week of recovery in the hospital turned into 4 weeks in the ICU. I suffered from many complications, allergic reactions. The attachment was leaking. I went 4 weeks without a sip of water or a bite of food. They fed me through IV and tried to keep me alive. My wife came to New York City every day. and we would pray together. Even though I was suffering tremendously, I found peace in our prayers. And knowing that whatever would happen, it was at God's will. The fact that it was in his hands brought me even more peace. I left the hospital on June 12th, came home, completed all my rehab, and was back at work, leading my usual life by the end of July. But now I had God's grace to guide me. My wife and I attend church every Sunday. We pray regularly. She was initiated into the Catholic Church last March, and we had our marriage convalidated in the church. We pray and work hard to bring my children into the faith as well. Our faith is the most central, important part of our lives. It's a good life, one I wish I had found sooner. The crazy haze and chaos that was in my mind and my body was gone. I am truly happy, even if I don't know how long I have here. I know that God saved me. It's up to him what happens going forward. I often wonder, though, where and what I would be if God hadn't saved me. Would I be a follower, or did God know and he had to save me by saving me? I want to leave you gentlemen with two things. First, if you ever feel sick or you think something's wrong, go to the doctor. The sooner you get there, the better chance you have. And the second, always keep your promise. This prayer saved my life. And so did John Revelle. Thank you.